Now, about a month ago, I posted a video looking at some of the best watches for smaller wrists. And I know people give me a hard time always talking about watches for smaller wrists because I myself have a small wrist, but I want to give some love to the people that have larger wrists out there and look at 16 of the best watches for larger wrists, or at least some of my favorite picks as we close out 2021. So the watches we're going to be looking at here are going to be 42 millimeters and above. They're going to be listed out in ascending order, starting with some more affordable stuff and then working our way up to luxury. And I'm only going to touch on the watches kind of briefly. If you want any more additional details in regards to some of the watches I'm going to be looking at here today, a good portion of these I have a full in-depth review on, so I can link to those down below. Now, before we jump into this video, I have an honorable mention as well as a watch that's available on teddybaldassarre.com. One of my personal favorites with the Longines Skin Diver. Now, I absolutely love this watch. Unfortunately, it is a little bit of a larger watch, so I can't really pull it off as much as I would like. There's a lot of things going for this watch though. 70 hours with its approximate power reserve. You're getting 300 meters of water resistance, a proprietary movement that is being made exclusively for Longines on the inside. And although a lot of people like to look at the Legend Diver as kind of that cool heritage looking dive watch from this brand, I think the Skin Diver needs a lot more love, and I'm a huge proponent of it. Definitely check it out, teddybaldassarre.com. So to kick us off with our first watch, we're going to be looking at Casio with the G-Shock. This one being the DW9052. Now this is probably the classic G-Shock for a larger wrist with a case size at 48.5 millimeters. It's not gonna wear the full dimension of that case size, but still is going to be a larger watch compared to like the DW5600, which are probably better choices for those with smaller wrists. But this watch, just like many other G-Shocks out there, is going to be towards the affordable end, this one being on the extreme affordable end, being south of $100. In contrast to what is probably the more mass appealing 5600, the 9052 collection features more of an oversized silhouette that G-Shock fans know and love. In particular, this model features a mineral crystal that is recessed into the case, making it a lot harder to actually try to damage. Also, the lugs are going to allow this one to drape around the wrist a bit more in terms of that strap, which is going to give it some charm despite its large stature. Now for our next set of watches, I have one brand that I want to look at here, and that's with Orient. First, with the non-professional option with the Orient Canoe. So the Orient Canoe is one of my favorite looking watches that Orient makes, although being a bit larger at 44 millimeters with its case size, lug to lug at 50.5 millimeters, it still is a great looking watch, and I just love the handset and just the dial design on this piece. Now 200 meters of water resistance is certainly going to be serviceable. It has an F6922 movement on the inside, in-house movement for Orient, typically running with better range of deviation than many Seiko counterparts. I've seen these things running in the single digits sometime, which is honestly just ridiculous for a $250 watch. But say you want to get into a more professional dive watch from Orient, that's where you have to look at the Orient Triton Neptune. Now, terms and what this thing is now known as, it's confusing as can be. They change the names all the time. Sometimes they drop using the naming convention. It simply doesn't make any sense. But basically, I'm talking about the professional dive watch that Orient makes, coming in that 43.5 millimeter case size, lug to lug of 51 millimeters, but coming with that true diver stamp in terms of its specification. Spectacular lume, has an automatic 40N5A movement on the inside. So this is a movement that's going to be used in some of the higher level Orient watches. And this is a watch that has a cult-like following and is one that really, I think, sets a standard in many ways in terms of value in the dive watch perspective from Japan. And don't lie to yourself, you knew Seiko was going to be on this list. And the one we have here is the Seiko Arnie, the SNJ025. So this watch is an analog digital display, which is not for everybody. But this watch was famously known for being on the wrist of Arnold Schwarzenegger in the film Predator. And honestly, whoever was responsible in the wardrobe department for putting this watch or the original watch on Arnold, honestly, an amazing job, and they deserve a round of applause because it's such a good fit. In terms of this watch, it does have some presence, 47.8 millimeters with the case size, but pretty condensed lug to lug dimension of 50.5 millimeters, all things considered. Now this watch is going to wear pretty true to a 44 millimeter case, if not a little bit bigger. Has an analog digital display, which is going to maybe be a bit polarizing for some out there on the market, but this is one that has a lot of charm associated with it, but also of course being very capable in the process with 200 meters of water resistance. Now, one of the best entry-level Swiss watches, especially from a dive watch perspective, is the Tiso Seastar. But Tiso recently unveiled a new and improved and true professional dive watch from the Seastar collection with the Seastar 2000 professional. Now, although the size being too large for myself, there was a lot of things working in favor of this piece in terms of the specifications. You're talking 600 meters of water resistance, an 80-hour power reserve, up specification with the movement as well, and resistance to magnetism and what's happening in that regard. Also, in terms of the dial, this is basically like a love child between the Save the Ocean dials from Seiko and the Omega Seamaster Diver 300 meter with that wave dial coming together in a form factor of 46 millimeters that will look great on a larger wrist, and also available in a variety of colors, being available just at $1,000 or just around it if you get it on the bracelet, and just below it if you're going for it on a rubber strap. Now, when considering some of the most underrated watches in Swiss watchmaking, I think one that needs to be mentioned is Alpina. Now, the watch we're looking at here is the Alpiner IV. So this is kind of a combination of a few different points of influence. You have some pilot watch design, you have some Flieger design, and also getting a little bit of field watch design. Now, Alpina is a Swiss brand that has roots back to 1883, really developing a formula and ethos around alpinist principles. And when they're referring to that, they're really discussing the idea around the built specs and attributes in the area of resisting anti-magnetic fields, shock, great water resistance, and having watches that come in stainless steel. That was really the cornerstone of this brand, and this is probably one of those watches that best embodies it. And this watch, from a modern perspective, still delivers much on that promise. I can link to the full review of this piece on the review show, but just the case and how well it was finished and just being just above $1,000, there's just a lot to like. 100 meters of water resistance, sapphire crystal. The lume was also quite good on this one. 45 millimeters with the case size. They did just discontinue the 40 millimeter version. If anybody with a small wrist is watching it to this point, they probably have already fallen off at this point. But anyway, 52 millimeter with the lug to lug dimension. But I think this is a nice middle of the road type of watch that has a lot of appeal for an everyday watch in this price range. Now, I am a huge fan of the GMT complication. I find it incredibly useful. But when you're talking about watches, say even sub $3,000, let alone sub $2,000, you're not going to get a true GMT complication. Now, a true GMT, just very briefly, it's the isolated hour movement of that local hour hand. When you're dealing with movements from Soprod, Etta, Solita, this is not a feature that comes on the watch. So what you'll have to do is pull the crown out to the farthest position and adjust all the hands in order to change that local time. This, of course, isn't the worst thing in the world, but it does add some extra steps to the process. So to get a true GMT movement for around $1,200, that is absolutely ridiculous, but we do have one on the list here with the Medo Ocean Star GMT. Now, talk about perks when it comes to getting access to a movement like this, being a member of the Swatch Group. But Medo doesn't just try to take away from what is being offered to them and just below it. Although this is a larger watch, what this watch is delivering from a value perspective in other areas is absolutely phenomenal. The bracelet is one of the best in the categories. I'm a huge fan of all these Ocean Star bracelets. They do something that not enough brands do, and the on-the-fly adjustment with that dual button release in terms of that extension system is great. The lug to lug is actually not too bad for a 44 millimeter watch at 50 millimeters. Thickness also, considering it is a GMT, just 13.3 millimeters. 200 meters of water resistant, 80-hour power reserve, sapphire crystal, and a true GMT movement on the inside. An anomaly when it comes to watchmaking in this price range. Now, a brand that does a fantastic job with catering to individuals with smaller wrists is AORUS. So to see them on a list for larger wrists is probably a bit of surprise for some, but we do have a great example here with the AORUS Aquas Pro Diver. So this is the professional dive watch, the true professional dive watch from AORUS and the Aquas family. Now, this is going to come also with some pretty large stature, 49.5 millimeters with the case size, thickness at 17.5 millimeters and 53.7 millimeters lug to lug. This does kind of give off some Seiko tuna vibes in a way, but this is a very well built watch in terms of what it's delivering. 1,000 meters of water resistance. You're getting a bezel that's going to be drilled down, so it's going to be free from not getting knocked off in the most strenuous of conditions. This also has a sapphire crystal and also features the AORUS Caliber 400 with that 5-day power reserve, up resistance against magnetism and shock, and a pretty solid range of deviation when it comes to accuracy. Ever since it was released back in 2005, the Zen U1 has perhaps been the closest approximation to epitomizing the German dive watch. As As a result of its capable spec, utilitarian design, and offering superb legibility, it is certainly one of the coolest looking German watches out there and incredibly functional. The watch is a little bit on the larger size, but still incredibly wearable, 44 millimeters with its case size and a lug-to-lug dimension of 50.5 millimeters. I'm a huge fan of the U50, and if you like that format, of course, this is really where all of that stems from. We'll have a top grade movement with great regulation, this one featuring an automatic SW200, 1,000 meters of water resistance, sapphire crystal with some great anti-reflective coating treatment, also having some tegimented offerings with 1200 HV on the Vickers hardness scale. This thing is a German U-boat in the form of a wristwatch. Now, I don't think anybody likes when someone tries to be someone that they're not. I think we call people out when they're not being authentic about things. And I think the same thing could be said about watch brands. And one brand that is certainly not guilty of that is going to be Marathon. They just are what they are, and I really just appreciate that, and I know many other consumers do as well. Now, the Marathon Search and Rescue series is probably some of the most popular watches that we have on our site. People just absolutely love those things, and I can see why. But when you're talking about the largest watch from that offering, you have to look at the Seastar. So the Seastar is basically a chronograph, search, and rescue, and this is the biggest watch that Marathon pretty much makes. At 46 millimeters with its case size and a thickness at 17.2 millimeters, this thing looks thick and is thick with that recessed dial with the tritium tubes set on top, 55 millimeters with the lug-to-lug dimension, but it does come with 300 meters of water resistance, screw-down crown, automatic Valjoux 7750 on the inside with a sapphire crystal. You have a rotating bezel along the outside. This is just a pretty cool looking watch. And chronographs that are typically large, this one takes it to a new level. Now, before the recent release of the Tudor Black Bay 58 bronze, you only had one choice if you wanted to get in bronze for the Black Bay, and that was the 43 millimeter option. This version that we're looking at here is the Bucher Blue version that I actually reviewed on the channel in the past. The Black Bay bronze was initially released in 2016 with some pretty good feedback, and it had a lot of things going for it at the time and still do to this day that allow it to separate from other brands that are using the bronze material. The bronze alloy that's being used by Tudor is certainly a different type of mixture compared to a lot of other bronze out there on the market, as its patina is not as dramatic as other brands, and I think that is probably for the better when you're getting into the higher price brackets. I don't think you want something that's gonna look like a rusty penny after a few months of wear. Although it is a larger watch, it actually wears not much bigger than that of the 41 millimeter options, 52 millimeters with the lug-to-lug dimension, water resistance of 200 meters. You're getting an automatic cost certified Tudor MT5601 on the inside. And that blue dial with that Explorer style layout with the 369, I think just looks fantastic. Now, how could you have a video talking about watches for larger wrists and not mention Breitling? Here we're looking at the Breitling Navitimer B01 movement on the inside. So this watch comes in at a 43 millimeter case size with a thickness of 14.2 millimeters. And again, that automatic Breitling B01 chronograph movement on the inside. This is an automatic in-house Breitling chronograph movement that has been on the market for years. One of the true standards when it comes to luxury chronographs on the market, column wheel in fact as well. Very few brands can rival Breitling's history when it comes to making pilot and aviation style watches. The Navitimers are sometimes classified as being a little bit too busy, but if you're looking for a watch of this type, it is certainly the best representation of it. Just like Breitling as being a fixture for larger wrists out there, you have to also look at Panerai, and here we're looking at the Panerai Luminor with that classic, just crown guard design, this one being the PAM 01312. So Panerai has become a bit of a controversial brand, and I don't want to get into all of that in this video, but when you're talking about a watch that would just be so suitable for a larger wrist out there, Panerai is probably right there in terms of maybe some of the best offerings for that type of individual. Now Panerai, I wouldn't say that their heyday was during this period, but it's probably the right way to say it. During the 2000s, and during that time, I like to call it the bling era in many ways. Whether you're looking at hip hop culture and other aspects of that era of the late 2000s, Panerai was everywhere. I remember hearing stories about Panerai as soon as they would bring things out in the display cases back in that time period, they would just sell out immediately. They couldn't even put the watches in the display. These watches were that hot during that time. The fervor around Panerai certainly died down, but this is still a very interesting watch for this type of individual that we're looking at here today. And this is probably one of my favorite looking Panerais when you're talking about the Luminor format, despite it not really being something that I can really pull off. The watch comes in with a 44mm case, thickness at 15.5mm, and a lug-to-lug dimension of 53.5mm, and a very nice water resistance rating of 300 meters. Power reserve on that automatic Panerai P9010 movement is also impressive. And this is one of those watches that really kind of aligns with the heritage dating back to World War II and watches that were produced in that era for combat divers of the Italian Navy. For our next watch here, we have a ceramic case watch from Omega with the gray side of the moon. Now this is a watch that I have always loved the looks of, but really couldn't pull off fully on my wrist size. But that 44.25mm case is really not telling the whole story. Because that lug-to-lug dimension is 49.5mm and you're getting a thickness that is gonna be on the larger side, still, for people out there, this is gonna wear closer to that of a 42mm watch, despite maybe being a bit thick. Of all the side of the moon variations, this is probably the most understated and underappreciated. I think the combination of the ceramic case, which almost looks like this darkened titanium in terms of its color, and also considering that gray dial and that kind of grain style finish that it has to add texture, it just has this very subdued look, but also so refined in terms of its execution. This was also one of the earlier adopters until now the traditional moon watch has now adopted it, getting a coaxial automatic Omega movement on the inside. Some purists might not like the adoption of a coaxial movement on a Speedmaster, but when you're talking about a watch like this isn't something that's going to be in line with the purists, but that's certainly okay. For our next watch, we have the IWC Big Pilot. We're gonna be looking at actually the new one though, the 43mm option that was just unveiled at Watches and Wonders 2021. Now again, this is probably not going to be the choice amongst purists, considering this is going to be 43mm versus the 46mm that many Big Pilot fans are going to know and love. This still is going to be mass appealing and also appropriate on larger wrists. This watch comes with an in-house 60-hour power reserve movement, 100 meters of water resistance, tool-free strap changing system, and I like how this watch almost represents the perfect middle ground between the Mark 18s and the Big Pilot family. For our final watch on the list, we have the Rolex Sky Dweller, perhaps the most misunderstood watch that Rolex makes. Many people just write this thing off as just a blingy monstrosity or a blingy date just, but it's actually, I think, just brings way more to the table than many people are maybe aware of. Now this is an annual calendar, pretty complicated watch, and one of the more complicated watches that Rolex makes. One of the coolest things about this watch is the rotation of the bezel and how it almost feels like a bank vault, the way that you can just twist that fluted bezel around and it's just broad in terms of those just rivets on that bezel. It just truly pops and of course has that bling factor, but it is complicated as you have that rotation of the bezel that's going to allow access of that annual calendar and allowing the user to set the watch. I do have a full in-depth review of this watch on the channel. I did it a couple years ago. I'm sure it's still a good video, but certainly not up to the standards that I would hold myself at now, but definitely would recommend checking that out because I'm just a big fan of these watches. It has the 9000 series of movements from Rolex here on the inside, 100 meters of water resistance, 42mm by a 50mm lug-to-lug dimension. It's going to wear pretty reasonable to that 42mm dimension. It's a big watch, but it doesn't have a dimension set that's going to size really anybody out for the most part. It's really just the flashy nature of the execution that makes it have a bit more of an imposing factor when you have this one on the wrist. But all right guys, that is my list of looking at some of the best watches for larger wrists in 2021. If you did enjoy it, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. And also remember that I did this video. I know a lot of people hold it over my head that I just talk about smaller wristed watches out there. Don't worry, I have something for you larger wristed individuals as well. If you want to stay up to date with the content, be sure to follow on Instagram and also teddybaldassarre.com, full authorized dealer of over 30 brands, quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, also offer a full factory warranty for all the products that we're carrying, and 9 out of every $10 that we generate goes right back in the content that we're creating here, trying to foster up a new generation of watch enthusiasts in the process. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.